Thank you all for coming. This is really wonderful. I have to say, I'll start by saying, um, for so long there was nothing that you could find about Schonberg. No articles, no interviews, no videos, no nothing. And of course, now we have Spencer's excellent book, which I strongly recommend. Strongly, this thing was a godsend. But um, but I remember I first discovered Schonberg through Roger Corman's movies, House of Usher and Premature Burial. I mean, the paintings in it were so striking and so vivid. And his name was in the credits of House of Usher. And I was like, who is this Schonberg? Who is this Schonberg? And then, I mean, it took me 7 or 8 years till I went to Fari Ackerman's house and I saw a drawing he had of the Frankenstein monster Schonberg had done. But only years later did stuff start to come forward. So I'll start by saying, Spencer, how did you first discover Schonberg and his work?
Well, I came to him via doing my research for my Cameron book. And the first trip I did to LA to conduct the first set of Cameron interviews in 2005, I believe it was. As you say, back then, I mean, we were talking 20 years ago now, there was scant information about Burt. I had the photograph of Burt and Cameron that appears in the book of them together at the Erenbu Ranch out in the high desert. So I knew they'd been lovers, and I knew that he'd contributed those fantastic portraits to the Roger Corman films. But other than that, there was very little else out there about him. Luckily enough, one of the first interviews I did for the Cameron book was with one of her closest friends back in the 50s, a woman called Joan Whitney, who starred alongside Cameron in Kenneth Anger's film Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome. She portrayed Aphrodite in the film. And as luck would have it, Joan's partner, Daryl, was a very close friend of Burt's back in the 60s. And when I brought up Burt's name, he immediately kind of pricked up and said, "Oh my God, he'd known Cameron tangentially, but he was really very good friends with Burt." And then he introduced me to another one of Burt's friends, a guy called Iro Desky. And what struck me about them was that this was 30 years nearly after Burt had passed, and yet they were still very deeply affected by him and the profound presence that he'd had on their lives. And then when they shared some of his artwork, some of his images of his artworks with me, that's when the germ hit that, once I finished telling Cameron's story, I should really turn my attention to Burt.
And the bug bit you. Yeah, yeah. It's like it's his work, once you've seen it, is just unforgettable. Now, Stephen, how did you first discover Schonberg's work?
Well, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I grew up in Montreal. I was born in 1962, ironically the same year that the premature burial was made. And Montreal it's freaking cold, right? It's like one of the coldest cities in the world. And I remember as a 10-year-old kid, and like I was tuned into art by then. I had an aunt who was a fairly successful abstract artist in Montreal, and she would spoil me with art supplies and books on all the dark stuff, like Hieronymus Bosch and MC Escher, and she gave me books on Francis Bacon. And so at 10 years old, I was kind of already tuned into the esoteric stuff. But I remember this vividly, okay? I remember looking in the TV guide one day, it's like the little magazine you get that shows you all the programs that are going to be on. I remember seeing a midnight showing of Roger Corman's House of Usher starring Vincent Price. And I absolutely idolized Vincent Price, even at midnight. So I remember we had this little playroom. We had this little playroom in the basement, right? It was kind of semi-finished, looked like a rug, but cement floor, a little black and white TV and some furniture. I remember sneaking down there quietly, right? Because I really wanted to see this film. So I turned it on our little black and white TV, and I just remember being absolutely mesmerized by these paintings that were part of this narrative and this story. I remember being such a formative moment for me, like even as a little tyke, seeing these paintings and seeing the power, the narrative power of art and these things. And it was a real little kind of life-shaping event for me to see those. And, I kind of went on and evolved into like an artist, art dealer, et cetera, et cetera. And it wasn't until, let me see now, it would have been about 2015 that this guy, Brian Chittister, walked into my gallery and he was like, trying to tell me all this stuff. Yeah, yeah. And he starts talking about Burt Shonberg, right? And I'm just like, geez, these paintings are really strange. He's showing me some prints or whatever. And and then it clicked right there. I thought, this is the effing guy who made the paintings that scared the living crap out of me when I was a little kid. And were so formative, in my development towards being drawn to the esoteric art and all that. So yeah, like Spencer, I was bitten by the bug. I just like had to find out everything I could about him. And it was really difficult to find. And I found a work of art. I found a painting of his for sale on the web through this place called Laughing Dome Records. I didn't know what the heck this was, right? But it was a painting kind of atypical of his work, but it was kind of a very cubist portrait, right? Quite complex, actually, and really beautiful materially. So I emailed them and tried to find out what this was about. And this guy replied back to me as Marshall Burrell. And I thought, wow, any relation to Milton? And as it turned out, it's Milton Berle's nephew, right? And he was the guy who knew Burt after George, how do you pronounce his last name? George Greif? George Greif was the original manager who set up the original show. And then Marshall Burrell was Burt's manager as well. And at the same time, he was managing Van Halen and Ike and Tina Turner and a bunch of really,
Was he managing Spirit?
Spirit. That's
Yeah.
right. Randy
Yeah,
California.
because
Spirit.
Schonberg did some album covers too, like Spirit of '76, and he did art on the back of Ron Goodwin's Music in Orbit, and there's Love's Out There.
Love's album out there. Yeah.
That
So
beautiful gatefold.
just to finish up quickly here. So I started to develop a rapport with Marshall, has such a generosity of spirit. I mean, he's such a great guy, right? And he started, plugging me in to the whole ecosystem of Schomburg as he knew it, and Burt Schomburg, you'll probably get to this better than I can, Spencer, but Burt Schomburg was an associate of George Clayton Johnson, very famous screenwriter who wrote episodes of Star Trek and The Twilight Zone and so on and so forth. And they had this beat coffee house called Café Frankenstein in Laguna Beach. And when the place sold, they Burt paid off George Clayton Johnson his share of the establishment in works of art. So when George Clayton Johnson passed away, those were inherited to his daughter, Julie Olive, and she wanted to sell the collection. So Burt hooked me up with them, and we acquired the entire collection, which became the nucleus of the show that we did at the Buckland Museum of Witchcraft in, I think it was 2021. And we did the first catalog there as well. And we picked up pieces along the way, and the collection continues to evolve this day. And I have to say, gracious thanks and eternal gratitude to the Philosophical Research Society, to Dennis Bartok and Kelly Carmina, the gallery director, Eric Tanner, who beautifully installed the show. I mean, I couldn't have asked for a better design and presentation of the exhibition. It just absolutely puts the artist's integrity in the forefront. It's a dream come true to see this exhibition. Allison Stevens and Amanda Marcial Altunez, who we know as Dama, who designed this absolutely beautiful catalog, which we're, honored to have Spencer's essay in it. We're honored to have your essay in it, Justin, and beautiful words from the late Roger Corman. It's just so, like the exhibition, this is so beautifully designed, like you couldn't ask. This is like a book you would see at the Met bookstore, it's just so absolutely fantastic.
Well, I
So,
was going to say, no, what you had said about it being a dream come true, it really is. I mean, there was so little about him. There was so little information. The paintings that he was talking about, that George Clayton Johnson had, I saw them 20 years ago when I visited George at his GI Bill house out in Pacoima. He had a wall of about 14 of them, and you can see some of them over here at the gallery. And at the time, it was just like a bolt of lightning. You know, there was very little about him online or anything else. And weirdly, he mentioned Brian Chittister, who brought Schonberg's art to his attention. I used to live in Charlottesville, Virginia, and a friend of mine said, "Oh, you got to meet this guy, Brian Chittister. Like, you guys have a lot of similar interests." And at the time, I was interviewing movie people who had worked with Schonberg. And I met Brian, and he was interviewing all these art people, and he was delving into the coffee shops that Schonberg had done murals at and so forth. I mean, what are the odds that the two of like the three people on the planet that are researching Burt Schonberg were in the same town? So, but anyway, my next question says, Spencer, what was it that you found so compelling about his art that drove you to write a full biography?
Well, firstly, there's an array of styles. There's not just one particular style, although that the faux stained glass style that has become his signature, that seeing examples of that, they're still some of my favorite pieces. Also, the fact that he's probably, I can't think of any other fine artist who has used his interest in ufology as subject matter. And I'm a little bit disappointed that more ufologists haven't kind of turned their attention on Burt's work. But it just really, just the beauty. I mean, I have a couple of pictures of his around me now, and just the aesthetic beauty of some of them just really knocked me out. And also, when you think of him, of his psychedelic era, it's not what you immediately think of as psychedelic. You know, it's not about the colors or the abstractions. What he's really getting across in those kind of paintings is really kind of capturing a state of being, a transcendent state of being. And that is very, I think, quite unique for an artist.
Well, also, I remember in your book, some of the people you interviewed had said he would trip and then reproduce it on masonite or canvas or whatever. People would say, wow, that's exactly what it looked like. There was a lot of fidelity to the actual experience.
Yeah.
And so why do you need drugs when you've got Burt Schonberg paintings? But I was really struck. It's funny, I do not support the use of psychedelic drugs in general, as I don't think it's something that necessarily spurs creativity. But I have to admit, the jump in Schonberg's work from when he wasn't using drugs to when he used drugs is very, very striking. And I was looking at the pictures he had done as a youngster versus what he did as, you know, when he was taking LSD and so forth. And I thought, this is your brain on drugs, and something's working. But he actually, no, so he was involved in Dr. Janiger's LSD experiments at UC Irvine, was it?
UC Irving. The thing I'd say about psychedelics is that, I experimented when I was a teenager with them. And if you open those doors of perception that Huxley talks about, they remain open. You don't have to keep taking the drugs.
Right.
Once those doors are open, they remain open. But I mean, Burt was a true believer in the psychedelic experience, as he was in ufology. You know, if Burt and Cameron could have been tractor beamed up into a saucer, they would have done it like a shot.
No, I think so. How many of you are familiar with Marjorie Cameron and her work? Okay, some of you. So, Spencer, tell just for the benefit of those that aren't familiar with her, talk a little bit about Marjorie Cameron, the artist otherwise known as Cameron.
Well, I mean, she's most known now as for her work with Kenneth Anger in Inauguration with the Pledge Dome, and finally, post-death, her work has become a lot more widely known than it was during her lifetime. We're hoping that we can do the same thing for Burt that's happened with Cameron. I have a feeling that when Burt and Cameron first met, as I say in the catalogue, I think she saw something within him and helped him bring it out of himself. She was 10 years older than Burt. She'd already had an awful lot of experience with sex magic. She was a follower of Aleister Crowley. And I think that she helped Burt take himself far more seriously as an artist than he had up to then. He was at that time when they first met working as a commercial artist. And I think she saw that he was actually, there was a visionary lurking inside this commercial artist, and she helped put it out of him.
Also, I was going to say, there at a certain point in his career, there became a heavy occult content in his work. He started using a lot of mythic creatures, sphinxes, things like that, and Baphomet, the sort of satanic figure, and the ufology. Did a certain amount of that inspired by and cultivated by Cameron?
Most of it, I would say, most of it. Although I think, the interest in ufology and outer space happenings was there in his childhood. That was he was part of that generation that was turned on by Orson Welles' radio broadcast of the War of the Worlds. And, if you look at some examples of his juvenilia, you can see, his interest in outer space happenings, and also, of course, his interest in comic books of the time. Particularly Captain Marvel was his particular personal comic book hero.
Now, I was going to say, let's talk a bit about Café Frankenstein. At one point in LA, there were coffee shops everywhere, beat coffee shops, hippie coffee shops, just everywhere. And they're all long gone. I mean, I think I think I can safely say they're all long gone. But Café Frankenstein was started by George Clayton Johnson, Burt, and Doug Myers way down in Laguna Beach. So tell us a bit about, and you had mentioned the faux stained glass artwork, which figured prominently. So tell us a bit about Café Frankenstein.
Well, I believe that Burt was inspired by Herb Cohen's Unicorn Coffee House. That was the first coffee house in LA at the time. Herb Cohen's idea, who I interviewed, was to bring a slice of Greenwich Village to LA. And so Unicorn was the first coffee house. Burt actually designed the menu for the Unicorn, and then got the idea within that year to open his own coffee house, as you say, and that became Café Frankenstein. But it was inspired by what they'd seen, the success of the Unicorn, which was right next door to what is now the Whiskey A Go-Go. So it was on the Sunset Strip.
Because he had also did, I think, murals in there was a restaurant called the Seven Chefs that burned down, the Purple Onion, I think, the Bastille, all of these long gone places.
Yeah, he was like the muralist of the day. He was the guy to bring in, and he would transform the interiors and sometimes the facades of these coffee houses.
Now I have to ask you, Stephen, of the Shonberg pieces you have, do you have any specific ones that are favorites? Any that you really, really love above all others?
It's really interesting because, the more magnanimous masterpieces like the Lucifer painting, just draw you in over a lifetime. I mean, you look at it once and you go live life, and then you come back and you see more in it. And you see, all the subtleties, like all the kind of the rhythmic patterns of the brushstrokes, like kind of like how Van Gogh would do it. And then another day you come up to it and you just feel all that atmospheric weight that he put into it, and all the kind of depth of field and the soft focus, and there's just so much to it that it takes a lifetime to really get to know them. So then, other smaller works, which this is a portrait. This is a portrait of the Bride of Frankenstein, I believe, that might have actually been in the Café Frankenstein. Spencer would know more about it than I would, but this is like it's like a dark horse, this one almost, it's like you kind of like, oh, go, it's like just a regular portrait, but then you start seeing more and more and more into it. I originally thought this might have been a portrait of Cameron, but I think Spencer pointed out to me that it was the Bride of Frankenstein. But it's really interesting what Spencer was saying about the Whiskey Go-Go, because Marshall Burrell, again, he was the talent manager for Whiskey Go-Go. I remember I just found this out maybe yesterday I found this out, but it's just it's really amazing. The whole ecosystem of the story, how all these things are interconnected, like the whole Marjorie Cameron, the Jack Parsons was married to Marjorie Cameron, and then after he blew himself up, she went with Burt, and the whole Café Frankenstein thing with George Clayton Johnson and all his Hollywood connections, and then the whole connection. Hang on, then the whole connection to Hampton Fancher, who wrote Blade Runner, and the Oscar Janiger connection, and all these things, how they're interconnected. And you read Spencer's really marvelous book, and you think, what an effing great movie this would make. It would just, and the whole Laurel Canyon connections and everything, and Joni Mitchell, and I actually read somewhere that someone said that her line in the song "They Paved Paradise" and put up a parking lot, that was in reference to Café Frankenstein, because she knew all those guys, right? I don't know how true this is, but it makes for a great story, right? That the Café Frankenstein, once it was sold, it went on for a couple of years, and it was torn down and turned into a parking lot, and that there was some connection there between. I mean, it's romanticism.
Well, that describes about half of Los Angeles, though. So
yeah, probably.
that sounds like bullshit.
I'm just saying, if there's a producer out there who's watching, or if there's like Spencer has an itch to make a screenplay out of his book, I just think that it's a phenomenal story to be told, right? Absolutely phenomenal story. And another kind of interesting thing, there's so many little coincidences in this whole story, right? That's mind-boggling. But one really interesting coincidence, which still has me wondering, is the Café Frankenstein was in Laguna Beach from 1958 to 1960, I think, was when Schonberg and George Clayton Johnson and Douglas Myers were proprietors. This other artist, that I champion, and they have probably the world's largest collection of his work, is William Mortensen, who is a really well-known photographer in Hollywood in the 1920s and early 30s. But he moved to Laguna Beach, and I've looked on maps as where the Café Frankenstein was and where his initial studio was, and they weren't that far from each other. I gotta believe that these two guys crossed paths sometime.
Yeah, well, it was interesting because, as he was saying, there were all of these groups he was sort of trafficking in. Like, he was very connected to people in the movies that he listed, and also the whole Roger Corman gang, because the people I interviewed initially about Burt were like Mel Wells, who was an actor in a million of Roger's movies, like he's Mushnick in the original Little Shop of Horrors, and he had been a patron of Burt's and bought a ton of his artwork. And Chuck Griffith, that wrote Bucket of Blood and Little Shop of Horrors and all that, who had lived with Burt. There had been a house that he and a bunch of other people had shared. He actually gave me this sort of crazy sketch thing that Burt had done. And Richard Matheson, who was one of the greatest practitioners of fiction of the last century. And Matheson had this absolutely stunning painting of Atlantis that he had gotten from Burt. And he told me, he said, if you look at it long enough, it's almost like one of those magic eye pictures from the 90s where stuff starts popping up that you didn't know was in there. And his son, R.C. Matheson, has it now. There were all those people. There were all the artists he was connected with. Also, that reminds me, Spencer, I was going to ask you, who were Burt's major artistic influences? I think Picasso was one.
I'd say Picasso more than anybody. And I thought that even before, while I was writing the book, up until then, it was thought that Dali was his great. When I was researching, writing the book, the influence of Picasso was a lot more stronger to me. And then, after the book was published, as often happens, I found a newspaper interview with Burt in which he confirms that Picasso was his great artistic influence. So, and there are wonderful little homages that he does to certain artists that he liked. There's a certain homage to Picasso. There's another one to the great surrealist photographer Angus MacBean. So he pays homage to the guys that inspire him.
Now, I was going to say, we'll talk a bit more about his use of psychedelic drugs and so forth. He had been involved with Janiger's experiments, and Cameron introduced him to peyote, I believe.
Peyote, yeah. Cameron had been taking peyote since at least 1953. She was sent away to but you could get it from a botanical garden in Texas, and she would cook it up like vegetables and eat it like, I guess, sprouts or whatever. There was a guy, but really by the early 60s, there was a famous guy, or famous on that scene, called Art Grady, who became known as the Peyote King. And he would just go around to the hangouts, to the coffee houses or to the nightclubs, and he would just leave peyote buttons on the table for patrons to use and abuse. One thing I will say is that peyote can often make you feel sick. So there's a couple of people who I interviewed for both the books who would tell me that during that time, people would actually take it anally, because that way it wouldn't make you vomit if you took it anally.
Well, now let's talk about the how do I top that? That's the mic drop right there.
I wanted to give you a top tip for the evening.
The touche. No, I was going to say, let's talk about the sheer quantity of drugs that Burt was taking, because I think, in preparation for this, I chatted with a couple of friends of mine who had taken ayahuasca in Peru under careful supervision, and they described the whole thing to me in this extraordinary experience they had, and then they said, and we did it once, and that was it. It was like never again. And but I think Burt's big mistake was to really fall down the rabbit hole, and he did. I mean, how many years was he doing LSD? I think it was 17 years, something like that.
He was taking LSD for at least 17 years, I'd say, off and on, yeah. And he was taking the real stuff as well. I mean, he was taking the stuff that Janica had was the stuff that came from Sandoz, from Switzerland. So this was the real McCoy. He would also taking Owsley stuff from San Francisco. He and his flatmate Ledru would go up to San Francisco and get window pane, which was some of the strongest acid you could get in the 1960s. And then there was, of course, the orange sunshine that he got his hands on. So, I mean, as I say, he was a true believer. He really was a psychedelic ranger, He really... I mean, it gives me the shudders to think of how many trips the guy had over the years. And but it did have, a very, at times, there was a positive effect and a very detrimental effect. There's a section in the book where I relate the last glimpses that many of his friends had of him. And he was almost like a derelict, walking down the Sunset Strip, gesticulating wildly, talking to himself, having conversations with imaginary forces. It was very scary for people. And of course, back then in the 1960s, there wasn't the same knowledge about how to deal with somebody in such a state. So for many people, he became a very scary figure for a lot of his friends, and that was really the last time many of them saw him.
Yeah, and he died at 44. And he really was a 60s casualty. It was a tragedy. I mean, he had no sense of moderation in terms of the drugs he was taking and so forth. And he was just, by the end, he probably didn't know what dimension he was in, but now I'll ask you both, Stephen, why do you think his work fell into such deep obscurity for so long?
I don't know. It's really hard to tell. I've a background in what's called outsider art. Artists like Henry Darger and Adolf Wolfley, and I was manager of the top gallery in the world for that kind of art for almost, what was it, 8 years or something like that. So a lot of these artists fall into obscurity just because they're just neglected. They're just not perpetuated by curators or dealers or whatever who have an agenda that they want to perpetuate, and they want to build a market for a certain artist or whatever, right? So but it's really beautiful when the day the sun shines on these artists, and it's like, whoa, how come we haven't heard of this guy before? His art is so magnificent, and his life story is so intriguing, and there's such an aura of authenticity surrounding it. And a lot of times, and this isn't any kind of criticism towards the kind of the academia of cultural curation, but often, when things can't be described in these little, can't be put into little boxes, in terms of the art historical continuum, particularly within the context of American cultural history. And you have these outliers like Burt Shonberg and Cameron and Henry Darger and William Mortensen, and people who just don't really fit into the box somehow, and those are usually the true visionaries, in my experience anyway, right? Those are usually the true game changers. And I know that Schonberg had a huge influence, many, many, many artists within the realm of the so-called psychedelic art, and dealers and curators who specialize in that field do have an awareness of them, but they're not quite sure what to do with them. They're not quite sure how to package him and have it perpetuate their own agenda at the same time, right? So I think since Spencer kind of underlined or underscored the fact that Schonberg had an association and a kinship and affinity with Marjorie Cameron, who is like, a cultural icon at this point, right? I think since that link was made, people who are like, either artists that specialize in esoteric things or specialize in esoteric art, they're starting to pay more attention to him, and less so as like a footnote to Cameron, but as a force unto himself. So certainly the show is going to draw attention. It already has, right? And it's again, I can't express my gratitude enough for how beautifully the show is presented and put together.
Well, I was going to say, I think my guess at why he slipped away for so long was partly because and Spencer, I want to hear your opinion on this too, but Schonberg just didn't seem to have much interest in either money or posterity. Apparently, he was very prolific. He would sell his paintings for very little or give them away. And I don't think he had any sense of really caring about what his legacy would be. And I don't mean that in a dismissive way. I just think it was just how he was built. Why do you think it became so obscure, Spencer?
Well, he shared with Cameron the idea that their works existed on the astral plane. So whether they were in the earthly realm was immaterial. Their works existed forever on the astral plane. He said to one friend that he considered money a crime. So that tells you how commercially minded he'd become by the 1960s. No, I don't think. And when Marshall said to him, I'm going to make sure, to preserve your work, Burt just shook his head and kind of chuckled, he really wasn't, his mind really wasn't on the earthly realm.
No, I think that's right. I think that's right. He now the one thing that I'm really hoping will come out of this exhibit, will continue to keep happening, I think it will, is that more and more of Schonberg's art will surface, because I'm sure there's plenty more out there. And I think the top on everybody's list is the paintings of the Usher family from the House of Usher. And there's this extraordinary hellscape that he did in Roger Corman's The Premature Burial, called Some Consummations Devoutly to Be Wished, that Ray Milland's character does, with the sort of Baphomet and all of these tortures and the sort of Hieronymus Bosch kind of thing. And they've just seemed to have vanished. And there's stories about them, and there's theories and things like that. But
well, the two that Roger Corman had, Mr. Corman told me they were stolen from his office. And the one that supposedly Vincent Price had was not, his daughter confirmed, was not in the family collection at the time of her father's death. So we don't know where that one is either. But like you, I hold out hope that they will turn up at some point.
I think they will sooner or later. I mean, Richard Matheson's son told me about his dad had, I think it was a sketch Burt had done of the House of Usher, and it hung in his dad's office for a long time. And he said it was just this like creepy, oppressive, dreary, wonderful thing. And he remembered it so vividly. And I don't know what ultimately happened to it, but let's see. So Spencer, what have you discovered about Schonberg since your book came out? Came out?
Well, quite a few things. There's some things, if you pick up the catalog, there's some new information about him there. There's two new solo exhibitions that he had during his lifetime that nobody knew about, which I uncovered post-publication. There's a whole, there was a series of pictures that he did in the mid-60s about pollution, which I would just add are also missing, which a couple of his artist friends told me were amongst his greatest things that he ever did. Again, they're also currently missing. So fingers crossed they will also show up at some point. You and I, you mentioned Mel Wells. There's a film that Burt did with Mel Wells, which again is also missing currently, which we hope is sitting in an archive somewhere waiting to be rediscovered, called Code of Silence. I'd be really interested to see exactly what work Burt did on that as the art director on that film.
It's interesting, his Schonberg's movie career was so strange. There were the two Corman movies. There was the one Spencer mentioned. He's credited as the art director on Bruno Voda's The Brain Eaters, but his artistic influences in no way, shape, or form visible on it. Because I think he had done some storyboards for it that were just,
and they weren't used. Yeah.
And I think he worked on. There's a costume that he had painted in that Valerie Porter, his girlfriend, wears in Mondo Hollywood, and a couple of things here and there. But it's such a pity, as such a powerful impact as those paintings for the Corman movies have had over the years. It's such a pity he didn't work on many movies. I deeply regret that.
Yeah. I mean, Corman really did praise him highly, and I'm not sure about how much you said that. Mel Wells took credit for turning Corman onto Burt, but when I spoke to Roger Corman, he said, we knew if you hung out in LA, you knew about his work because it was hanging everywhere. It was in every coffee house. So Roger Corman told me that that's how he came to his work, by seeing it in the hangouts in LA at the time.
But I was going to say, and Chuck Griffith also told me he got Burt that job. So this is all part of hysteria. So
Mm,
they're all gone now, unfortunately. But
mm.
I just like to say, so Stephen, what would you like to leave the audience with? What would you like to what are your parting words to them about Burt Schonberg and his work and his legacy?
Well, um, whoa. So, Schomburg just had an aura of authenticity about him, very rare. And, as been mentioned, he didn't care about money. In fact, there was a newspaper article where he said he didn't really care about, how the audience felt or or how the audience felt about his art or something to that effect, He was on a vision quest of his own. And through the use of hallucinogenics, he was making his art were like portals, to the other side. And I spoke to this guy, Steve Ross, yesterday, who told me he was the one that introduced Burt to Marshall Burrell in the first place. And he was friends with LaDrew as well. And he talked about going over to their place, and they'd be tripping out on LSD, and they'd be making art in the process. It wasn't like they tripped out, then came down, and then made art that was like a memory or a secondary experience of what the trip was itself. They were tripping, trying to get to the other side and making art in the process. And I think that, well, at least at that time anyway. And I think that's a really important thing, because even Picasso, I think I read somewhere decades ago that he said, drugs are great, but you can't do anything when you're high. You have to come down. But here's an instance of an artist who is actually on a vision quest making his art. And I think that makes his art very shamanic in a way, and makes him a very shamanic figure as well. And his art ultimately acts as how do you say, like as a social healing tool. You look at this art, and I don't want to sound too new agey, but I'm talking about, a pragmatic experience of looking at Schomburg's art. And it's almost like you're bathing in astrolight when you see these works and you're in their presence, and there's something about them, right? There's something about these things. And it's like, well, is it the rhythm of the brushstrokes that's so real and so authentic and really shows, the interconnectedness of things? Or is it, the beautiful light atmosphere that, Roger Corman talks about in his essay? Or, what is it about? Well, it's a combination of all these things, right? And it's how this this artist got it right. He absolutely got it right. And you look at his art and you experience his art, and you stand in front of that Lucifer painting that's, in the show, and it's really hard to take a lot of art you see out there seriously after you see that. There's someone who really grabbed the bull by the horns, and took it to the extreme. Maybe psychologically he ended up talking to himself, walking in the street and scaring people. But here's someone who was authentic, and he took his experience, he took his vision, and made these cathartic, authentic works of art out of the process. And I think they're national treasures, personally.
Well, I got Spencer, I've just got a couple more minutes. So what would you like to leave the audience with about Schomburg's work and his legacy?
Well, I mean, I think it's fair to say we're not exactly inundated with fascinating cultural figures at the moment. And I think when culture hits a lull in the way that it has in recent years, it affords you the opportunity to say, look, here are a couple of artists who really didn't get their due during their lifetime, who were profoundly interesting, fascinating people. You really might want to check them out, because the kind of world that we live in today of commercialism, of celebrity, it doesn't actually have to be like that. There was a time when, people live for art's sake. And I can't tell you the amount of contemporary artists who've messaged me over the years to talk about how, they were inspired by Cameron, and increasingly, how they've been inspired by Burt. That's what I'm hoping, is that for a younger generation who are kind of not being catered well for culturally today. Sometimes it gives you the opportunity to delve back into the past and actually discover artists who can actually speak to you far more interestingly than artists of your own generation.
No, I agree. I'll paraphrase my late friend Peter Bogdanovich and say there are no old artists. There are just artists whose work you haven't seen yet.
Yeah.
And I'm really delighted that Schonberg is getting his due. I'm delighted that you all have come and that the paintings are on display. As I said, this, you know, when I was 14 years old, trying to figure out who the hell this guy was that did these amazing paintings that Vincent Price was riffing on, I never thought I'd live to see this. So this is really extraordinary. So I was going to say, Spencer, Stephen, thank you so much. Thank you so much
Thank you
for
so
your good
much.
work with Schonberg. Thank you all for coming.